Now, the third principle is called the single responsibility principle. Now, this is a very easy principle to understand, just like this image here. It said just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? So this looks very powerful, but from practical point of view, and then it is not really that useful, especially when it comes to changes. I'm pretty sure you can, pull off all some of these kind of tools, but then let's say one day I want to add and change or modify something. I think changing this kind of structure is going to be so much more difficult than changing just one. All right, so that's kind of the idea, and this idea, is also very true in our lives. For example, whenever you're, preparing finals, you got 4 or 5 courses to prepare, and then some of those are essays, some of them are programming, some of those are, just review books and doing exercises, and then the overwhelming different type of work often, make us so much more stressful. And maybe if we were given the same amount of work, but it's only one type of thing, in many cases we can handle it better because we could simply break it down into different stages and steps. But when we have too many things going on, we normally need to switch the gears and then try to, jump back and forth. And while we're working on one thing, we need to worry about the other thing, right? So that's where we got all the stress. And then same thing for your code. You should not really let your code do too many things at the same time. There's a very famous book called The Power of Less that talks about your time management. How can you actually should focus on less things, but the more important things. Let's take a look at this example here. We got a class called a customer, and the customer has a name and address attributes. Looks like it's a kind of very typical data class that contains these values. However, you also have this method called add a customer. Looks like you're trying to add this customer to the database. And you also have something called generate report. And based on the customer information, you print some kind of report. And looks very simple and readable, but again, this, if you look at it carefully, this class actually is trying to do quite a lot of things. And in general, we might only put a getter and setter for this class, but this one has things related with the database. This one has things about outputting things in a different format. So every single one of those is called a responsibility. Okay, so in this class, you got a multiple responsibility, plus there's one more responsibility where you need to store all the values. And this is really bad because when you put them all together, it is very likely when you're running and implementing one method, it may use or touch some other places. It may use some attribute, maybe also use some of this message. That's where the problem will happen, because at one point you need to change this method, and then turns out that it relies on the other method. Maybe it will force you to change the other one, or maybe more. And because when you are all sit together, you can have the access to this method, and that's why sometimes it is likely you will just use the other methods. All right, so that will potentially create a lot of connections, and the connections will actually build dependencies, and whenever the dependencies, when you are changing things, it will force you to do a lot of modifications. Right? That's why this is not very good. And then this image again shows the idea, right? So it is overload that kills all the structure. All right, so this is what the principle tells us. Every software module should only have one reason to change. All right, a software module could be a class, or it could be functions, and then you need to only, if you want to change, that's fine, but make sure you only changing it for one type of reason. Okay, so that's what this principle is telling us. All right, so this is a good way to build the same kind of system, that you really need to split all these responsibilities. Customer is just the data class with data attributes and getter and setters. Okay, you only use that one to hold the data. And you got a customer DB class that deals with all the create, insert, update, delete, all of those kind of methods that directly talk to the database. And finally, you got a customer report class that only handles generating the report with different kind of format, right? So in this case, very less likely you will actually need to rely on each other. And then, that's the nice part about this kind of a design, that every class only has one responsibility. If you need to change it, that means you want to change that one responsibility. All right, so everything will be more straightforward. And of course, every class, that doesn't mean that you only have one method. You can still have multiple methods, but just to make sure that they're all the same type of responsibility within the same context. For example, you can have an add, you can have a get, you can have a remove customer, and then generate a report. You can generate a report and then persist report. You can send report, all of this, right? So this one we're talking about a high level responsibility. And then the same principle also applies to the method. So for example, in this method here, let's take a look at it. Try to insert an employee object into the database. So what we're trying to do here is we create a string and to store the SQL statement. And then here we create a connection, and then using the string, and then we create some parameters, and then we create this final SQL command, and then we add some range parameters. Eventually we execute the query. Now, again, this code looks very straightforward, but they are actually different responsibility, because there are things about the database connection. There are things about getting the command ready with the parameter. There's also things about generating the command and executing the command. So a better way to do this, as you can see, this code looks similar, but it's a better split on the responsibility. So the first line become get connection, and the get connection is a method, and then this method just deal with how do we generate that connection object. So this is one single responsibility, and this one here has a get parameters, and then this one here just deals with how do we form the parameters, and finally get a command and just talks about how do we initialize the final command object, right? So every single method deals with runs responsibility. So when the point, if you want to change the parameter, you want to change the command, then just go to that method to change it, and that's going to be so much easier to maintain, right? So what we learn from this principle is just any kind of a code, make it really simple, and then the simple can just simply means that you write less code. Right, so that's why a very practical kind of a lesson you guys can learn very quickly is whenever you write your class and message, always remember the shorter the better, because when it's short, that means you can spend less time to understand it. You don't feel overwhelming, and then there's less interaction and connection that can happen within that one class or one message. Always the shorter the better. Okay, so this is another lesson that definitely very practical, and please keep in mind.